Okay, darling, the police is after me, but I know how to move. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are still crazy. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that everyone is a Nazi today. That is what you can have, that you are one too hard the people. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are all Nazis. They want to put us all on gas cameras and things like those. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they all want to put us on gas cameras and things like those. Of course, darlings, I bring you roses, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they want to put us on gas cameras and things like those. Of course, that is what you can have, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they want to put us on gas cameras and things like those. Of course, the police is so crazy. Of course, that is what you can have, that everyone is the Jew and he has to bury everyone and go back home to his wife. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, so come on. And of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they bring you roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. Of course, that is what you can have. Now they are so crazy with the cocaine. Of course, cane and napalm and things like those. And of course, that is what you can have, that everyone has his desires and has to let everything behind to get his desires. Of course, that is what you can have, that we are in cane and napalm now. Of course, take some cocaine. Of course, that's fun. Of course, that is what you can have, that everyone has his desires and has to let everything behind to get his desires. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. Of course, that is what you can have, that I give it them. That is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, you want. Of course, that is what you can have, that everyone is cane. Of course, that is what you can have, of course, because if not, they hit you in the face. Of course, that is what you can have, that everyone hits you in the face. Of course, and to don't be hit in the face, you have to be like Scarface. Of course, that is what you can have, that I give it them. Of course, everyone who is younger than me, I'm gonna make some Scarface. Of course, that is what you can have. Of course, and I bring you some summer roses. Of course, that is what you can have, to them with my witchy tiger here. Of course, that I bring you some summer roses. Of course, with my witchy tiger. Of course, that is what you can have, that just can see the true colors in my heart. Of course, that is what you can have, that I bring you some summer roses with my witchy tiger. That is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have, that everyone is cane. Of course, doing some cocaine. That is what you can have, that they give it them, that everyone who's younger than me, I'm gonna make some Scarface. That is what you can have, and bring some witchy tiger roses. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have, so come on. That is what you can see, that no one can against me, so let's go. Of course, darling, I bring you roses. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, they want to put us all in gas cameras. Of course, that is what you can have, that they can't against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, they want to put us all on gas cameras. Of course, that is what you can have. Of course, that is what you can see, that they can't against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that they can't against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they want to put us on gas cameras. Of course, but they can't. Of course, that is. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you can ring on my phone. Of course, darling, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, everything I want, of course, darling, we want, of course, darling, you can just dream, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can say, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I hear what I want, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they want to put us on gas cameras, but I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they will want that we pay God's money, of course, and they are asking my money for God, of course, I'm not gonna give them a single cent, that is what you can have, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have here, of course, darling, that my cross is sinning bad, of course, darling, that my cross is sinning gunshot, not the devil, of course, that word is yours and you have to let them, of course, you have to find the capital letters and let my cross and Christopher, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they can't against me, that you have to let them, that word is yours, of course, darling, I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, of course, darling, that is what you can have, of course, darling. Of course, darling, I bring you roses. Of course, darling, no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that they want to put us on gas cameras. Of course, they want that we give our money to a death guy. Of course, darling, I don't believe in John. Of course, I don't believe in Richard. I don't believe in John the Baptist. Of course, darling, I believe in Richard. That is what you can have. That I'm in the neighborhood. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, I bring you roses. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one. That I'm not gonna give a single cent to Mike, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm not gonna give a single cent to Mike. And I'm not gonna give a single cent to Christopher, of course. The voice is yours, you have to find the capital letters and let them both, of course, darling. That I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, of course, darling. I'm not gonna give a single cent to Mike and to no one, of course, darling. I'm not gonna give a cent to no one. That is what you can have. That my money is mine, of course, and I only believe in Richard, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That I don't believe in John, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That no one can against me, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling. That is what you can have. That I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one. I can show you that, of course, darling. That is what you can say. Of course, darling. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling. That is what you can say. That no one can against me. Of course, darling. That is what you can have. That I'm gonna give you everything you want. Of course, darling. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, I don't believe in John, that is what you can have. That I don't believe in John, I only believe in Richard, that is what you can have. That I bring you roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have everything I want. Of course, darling, I bring you roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. that they bring you some cocaine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they bring you some cocaine. That everyone who's younger than me, I'm gonna make some Scarface and bring you some witchy tiger roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they bring you roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they don't believe in John. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they don't believe in John. Of course, darling, I'm gonna shut it down. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they don't believe in him. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. That they don't believe in John. They don't believe in no one. That is what you can have. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, I want to put us on gas cameras. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they don't believe in them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they want to put us on gas cameras, but they don't believe in them. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, I'll bring you some witchy tiger roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Because I'm in the neighborhood and I'll bring you some roses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, I'm not gonna give a single thing to John. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't believe in no one. That I'm not gonna give a single thing to no one. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't believe in no one. That is what you can have. That I'm gonna shoot at John and I give a damn. That is what you can have. That I don't believe in them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna shoot at John and I'm gonna give a damn. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That you want to put us on gas cameras, but they don't believe in John. I'm gonna shoot at John. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. That I'm gonna shoot at John and I'm gonna give it them. That is what you can have. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have here. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I'm gonna that I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one. That I only believe Richard. Of course, darling, I don't believe in John. I'm gonna shoot at John and I'm gonna give it them. Of course, darling, I bring you some roses in the neighborhood. Of course, darling, love you and bye.